The Hargrove County Courthouse had been standing in the heart of rural Tennessee for over 90 years, and in all that time, it had never once tried to make anyone feel welcome. That was simply not its purpose. Its purpose was authority. Its purpose was finality. From the outside, the building looked exactly like what it was, a structure built by people who wanted you to feel small before you even walked through the door. The stone facade was thick and gray, darkened by decades of weather and time, the kind of gray that doesn't just describe a color but a mood. 4 wide columns framed the entrance like silent sentinels, and the heavy oak doors at the top of the steps had brass handles so cold in the October morning air that grabbing one felt like a warning. "This is serious," those handles seemed to say. "Whatever you brought with you today, it matters here." Inside, the building delivered on every promise the outside had made. The marble floors were pale and immaculate, polished to a shine that reflected the fluorescent lights overhead in long, watery streaks. Every footstep echoed, not just a little, but fully, completely, the sound bouncing off the walls and ceiling and coming back to you slightly altered, like a reminder that nothing said in this building would go unheard. The ceiling soared 2 stories above the main hallway, adorned with carved molding that had probably impressed someone greatly in 1934, and now mostly collected dust in the corners. The walls were painted a shade somewhere between cream and yellow that had likely been chosen to feel neutral, but had aged into something that felt vaguely institutional, the color of waiting rooms and bad news and decisions already made before you arrived. And yet, on this particular Tuesday morning in October, the courthouse was alive in the way that only conflict can make a building feel alive. The hallways were thick with people. Attorneys in dark suits moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had memorized every tile on these floors, their briefcases swinging at their sides like weapons they'd already decided to use. Court clerks weaved through the crowd with stacks of folders, their expressions the kind of professionally blank that takes years to perfect. Families clustered on the long wooden benches that lined the walls, some leaning together in quiet conversation, some sitting rigidly apart, staring at opposite walls with the careful intensity of people pretending the other person doesn't exist. A child somewhere down the hall was crying softly, and nobody seemed sure whether to acknowledge it or not, so mostly they didn't. The air smelled the way old important buildings always smell, a combination of floor polish, aged paper, and something faintly metallic, like the ghost of 1,000 tense conversations that had been absorbed into the walls over the decades. A ceiling fan turned slowly near the information desk, doing very little about the warmth that had built up from too many bodies in too small a space. A security guard near the metal detector had the look of a man who had been awake since 5 in the morning and was planning to be deeply unhappy about it for the rest of the day. Among all these people, on a bench halfway down the main hallway, sat Sandra Kellys. She was 29 years old, though on this morning she could have passed for older, not because she looked worn exactly, but because she carried the particular kind of stillness that comes from months of preparing for a single day. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly. She wore a gray blazer over a white blouse, an outfit she had tried on 4 times the night before, changing and rechanging in front of the bathroom mirror while Lily slept in the next room. She had settled on this combination because it felt serious without feeling desperate, composed without feeling cold. She had read somewhere that first impressions in courtrooms mattered even when judges claimed they didn't. She had taken that seriously. In her lap sat a manila folder, and inside that folder was the architecture of her life for the past 11 months. Custody agreements, financial disclosures, character references, school enrollment documents, a pediatrician's letter, 2 handwritten notes from Lily's preschool teacher describing what a warm and secure and loved child Lily appeared to be. Sandra had read through every single page the night before, not because she needed to memorize them, but because holding them made her feel less like everything was out of her control. The folder was the one thing in this building she had actually built herself. It was proof that she had shown up prepared. It was proof that she had not given up. Beside her, completely unimpressed by any of this, sat Lily. Lily was 3 years old and approximately 4 months away from turning 4, a distinction she took extremely seriously and mentioned to strangers with some regularity. She had her mother's dark eyes and her own entirely original approach to the world, which could be best described as enthusiastic and completely without fear. She was wearing a light pink sweatshirt with a small embroidered strawberry on the chest, dark leggings, and her favorite sneakers, white with pink Velcro straps that she had learned to fasten herself and was enormously proud of. Her hair was in 2 pigtails, slightly uneven because she had insisted on helping with the second one that morning, and Sandra had decided that an imperfect pigtail was a battle not worth fighting on a day that already held enough of them. Lily was not still. Lily was almost never still. While Sandra sat with her folder and her carefully managed composure, Lily was engaged in a complex and private study of the ceiling tiles above them, her head tipped all the way back, her small legs swinging off the edge of the bench without quite reaching the floor. She had already asked Sandra 3 questions in the past 10 minutes: why the floor was so shiny, whether the big doors were magic, and whether the man across the hall with the mustache was a king. And Sandra had answered each one quietly and patiently while keeping one eye on the clock above the information desk. Sandra had been dreading this day for months, not because she doubted her case. Her attorney, a sharp and reassuring woman named Claire Merritt, had told her repeatedly that the documentation was strong and the hearing was likely to go well. She dreaded it because nothing about a courthouse felt like the right place to make decisions about a child. Nothing about fluorescent lights and marble floors and men in suits felt like it had anything to do with the small, real, daily life she and Lily had built together. The morning pancakes, the bedtime stories, the way Lily still reached for Sandra's hand in parking lots without being asked. How was any of that supposed to fit inside a manila folder? How was any of that supposed to matter to a room that smelled like floor polish and old paper? She pressed the folder a little tighter against her lap and told herself, not for the first time that morning, to breathe. That was the moment Lily stopped looking at the ceiling. Her attention had caught on something at the far end of the hallway, near the main entrance, and Sandra could feel the shift in her daughter's body before she even looked up, that particular tensing of small muscles that meant Lily had found something worth investigating. Sandra followed her daughter's gaze down the length of the corridor, past the attorneys and the clerks and the families with their quiet anxieties, all the way to the entrance where a sheriff's deputy stood in full uniform beside a dog that was, Sandra had to admit, genuinely impressive to look at. The dog was large, alert, and still in a way that most living things simply aren't. Even from a distance, there was something about it that commanded attention, not in an aggressive way, but in the way of something that has been trained to be exactly what it is and has fully become that thing. Its coat was rich and layered, its ears upright and precise, its eyes scanning the room with a calm, methodical focus that somehow made the fluorescent lighting seem more serious. Lily stared. Sandra reached out and gently took hold of her daughter's hand, more out of instinct than necessity. She could already feel what was coming. She had been Lily's mother for 3 years. She knew that particular quality of stillness. It wasn't the stillness of hesitation. It was the stillness of a child gathering herself before she moved. And around them, the courthouse hummed and buzzed and echoed with the ordinary sounds of an ordinary Tuesday morning that was, without anyone realizing it yet, about 60 seconds away from becoming something else entirely. If you had walked into the Hargrove County Courthouse that Tuesday morning and done what most people do, kept your head down, checked your phone, thought about your own problems, you would have walked right past Officer Marcus Webb and Duke without a second glance. They were stationed near the main entrance the way they always were, positioned slightly to the right of the security checkpoint, close enough to the flow of foot traffic to be visible but far enough back to avoid being in the way. To a distracted eye, they were simply part of the scenery. A deputy and his dog, background detail. the kind of presence you register without actually seeing. But if you had stopped, if you had taken even 30 seconds to actually look, you would have understood almost immediately that Duke was not a background detail. Duke was the kind of animal that, once you truly looked at him, made you quietly reconsider every assumption you had ever made about what dogs were capable of being. He was a Belgian Malinois, 4 years old, with a build that managed to be simultaneously lean and powerful in the way of things designed entirely for function rather than appearance. His coat was a deep, layered blend of fawn and mahogany, darkening to black across his muzzle, and ears in the distinctive mask that Malinois are known for, a marking that gave his face a focused, almost serious expression even when he was at rest. His ears stood perfectly upright, slightly forward-angled, the kind of ears that seemed engineered to catch sounds that hadn't fully formed yet. His eyes were dark amber, clear and still, and they moved across the room in the slow, systematic way of someone who has been trained to see everything and react to nothing prematurely. He sat with his back straight and his chest forward, every line of his body communicating a single message: I am paying attention. I am always paying attention. Beside him, holding the leash with the relaxed grip of a man who had long since stopped needing to hold on tight, stood Officer Marcus Webb. Webb was 41 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered by 10 years of outdoor work into something that looked less aged than settled, like a landscape that has found its final form. He had joined the Hargrove County Sheriff's Department straight out of the Army at 26, spent 4 years on patrol, 2 years on the Narcotics Task Force, and then, in what his colleagues still occasionally teased him about, had voluntarily requested transfer to the K-9 unit after riding along with a handler during a search operation and watching a dog locate a hidden cache of stolen firearms in under 4 minutes. Webb had sat in that patrol car afterward and thought about it for a long time. Then he had gone back to the station and filled out the transfer paperwork before he could talk himself out of it. That had been 5 years ago. He had been partnered with Duke for 2 of those 5 years, and in that time, the 2 of them had developed the kind of working relationship that most human partnerships never achieve. A bond built not on sentiment but on absolute mutual trust, the kind that gets forged in the specific heat of real situations, where things can go wrong very quickly, and the only thing standing between a bad outcome and a worse one is whether you trust your partner completely. Duke's record spoke for itself. In his 4 years of active service, he had assisted in 23 narcotics cases, 11 of which had resulted in significant arrests. He had tracked a missing 7-year-old boy through 2 miles of dense woodland in the dark and found him unharmed, sitting against the base of an oak tree, cold and frightened but alive, crying with relief when Duke reached him before the search team did. He had located an elderly woman with dementia who had wandered from her care facility during a February snowstorm, finding her in a drainage ditch 3 blocks away, hypothermic but breathing, with 11 minutes to spare before the temperature would have made the outcome irreversible. He had cornered an armed robbery suspect in the lower level of a parking garage on Main Street, holding his position through 40 minutes of tense standoff negotiation, without a single command from Webb, simply reading the situation and responding to it, with a precision that the responding officers had talked about for months afterward. The department's K-9 trainer, a retired state trooper named Gerald Hatch, had evaluated hundreds of working dogs over a 30-year career. He had assessed Duke during his first year of training and written in his evaluation report, in the characteristically understated language of a man who did not give compliments easily: exceptional instinct, remarkable focus under pressure. This dog will distinguish himself. Gerald Hatch had been right about very few things in his personal life, according to his ex-wife, but he had been right about Duke. What made Duke genuinely extraordinary, beyond the certifications and the case numbers and the commendations, was something harder to quantify, something the handlers and deputies who worked around him regularly tried to describe and never quite managed to capture accurately. It was the quality of his attention. Most dogs, even well-trained working dogs, existed in a kind of ongoing negotiation between their instincts, their training, and their environment. They could be distracted. They could be uncertain. They could read a situation wrong. Duke seemed to operate from a different place entirely, a place of deep, almost preternatural calm from which he observed everything with equal and complete focus, never overreacting, never underreacting, simply present in a way that felt less like animal behavior and more like a considered choice. Webb had tried to explain this to his wife once, late at night after a long shift, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold. He had said something like, "Most dogs react to the world. Duke watches it." His wife had nodded slowly and said that sounded like a very expensive dog to feed. Webb had laughed and decided that was probably the best response available. That Tuesday morning, Duke was doing what he always did, watching. His amber eyes moved steadily across the courthouse lobby, tracking the flow of people with the measured patience of someone who understood that most of what he observed would require nothing from him, and that the moment something did, he would already have seen it coming. He was not tense. He was not restless. To any observer in that hallway, he looked exactly as he always looked: composed, authoritative, perfectly calibrated. But something was different that morning, and it existed below the threshold of what most human observers were equipped to notice. It was subtle, genuinely, almost imperceptibly subtle, the kind of subtle that only reveals itself in retrospect, when you know what you're looking for and go back to examine the details you glossed over the first time. Duke's left ear, normally held at the same precise upward angle as his right, was tracking slightly differently, not drooping, not obviously misaligned, but carrying just a faint asymmetry that hadn't been there last week. The set of muscles around his left eye held a tension that was too small to read as pain, but too consistent to be nothing. And every few minutes, so briefly it could easily be dismissed as a normal head adjustment, Duke tilted his head just a degree or two to the left, as if the world on that side had gotten fractionally louder or fractionally wrong, and he was trying to correct for it without making a production of the effort. Webb hadn't noticed. He would be honest about that later in a way that clearly cost him something. He had been monitoring the entrance flow, scanning faces, running through the mental checklist of a courthouse security detail, doing his job with the competence and focus that 10 years had made second nature. Duke was at his side, Duke was steady, Duke was Duke. There had been no alarm to raise, no threshold crossed, no moment where something obvious had announced itself and demanded attention. Nobody in that building had noticed. Nobody who had been there long enough to develop the habit of looking at the world and seeing what they expected to see, rather than what was actually there. Down the hallway, on a wooden bench between a water fountain and a bulletin board covered in legal notices, a 3-year-old girl in a pink sweatshirt had stopped swinging her legs. She had stopped looking at the ceiling tiles. She had gone very still in the particular way of a child who has just found something worth every bit of her attention. And she was looking directly at Duke. Not at the uniform, not at the leash, not at Officer Webb with his badge and his broad shoulders and his authority. She was looking at the dog, only the dog, with an expression on her small face that her mother, glancing over, would later describe as the same expression Lily had worn the morning she had pressed her ear against Biscuit's side and said he hurt inside. The courthouse hummed around them, indifferent and marble-floored, and entirely unaware of what was about to happen in its hallway. Duke's left ear shifted slightly, just slightly. Lily saw it. There is a particular kind of moment that exists in busy public spaces, a moment so brief and so easily missed that most people never even register it has occurred. It happens when something unexpected cuts through the noise, when something so out of place or so quietly extraordinary interrupts the ordinary rhythm of a place, and for just a fraction of a second, before anyone has fully processed what they've seen or heard, everything pauses. Not dramatically. Not like the movies, where the record scratches and every head turns in slow motion. Just a small, collective catching of breath, a ripple of interrupted thought moving through a crowd like a wave that doesn't quite break. That moment happened in the Hargrove County Courthouse hallway at approximately 9:47 in the morning, and it was caused by a 3-year-old girl in pink sneakers. It started the way most significant things start, small, quiet, and entirely unannounced. Sandra had turned her attention back to her folder. It was a habit she had developed over the past hour of waiting, check the documents, confirm the order, reassure herself that everything was there, everything was correct, everything was in place. It was a nervous habit and she knew it, but knowing it didn't stop her from doing it, and so her eyes were down, her fingers moving across the top sheet of paper when she felt it. Not heard it, felt it. The particular absence of a small, warm presence beside her on the bench. The way a room feels different the moment someone leaves it, even before you look up to confirm they're gone. Sandra looked up. Lily was already 3 steps away. There was no running, no tantrum, no dramatic declaration of intent the way there sometimes was when Lily had decided she wanted something and wanted it immediately. This was quieter than that and somehow more determined. Lily was walking with the kind of focused, deliberate purpose that Sandra had learned to recognize as more unstoppable than any amount of running. The walk of a child who has made a decision so completely that the possibility of not following through on it simply hasn't occurred to her as an option. She was heading straight for Duke. Sandra was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand, the folder clutched against her chest, her mouth already forming Lily's name. But something made her hesitate, some instinct she couldn't have named in the moment, some flicker of recognition that stopping Lily right now might interrupt something that was supposed to happen. She took 1 step forward and then stopped, watching, her heart somewhere in the vicinity of her throat. Officer Webb had seen Lily coming. His training kicked in automatically, a subtle shift in his stance, his right hand moving toward Duke's harness with practiced efficiency, his eyes doing a quick professional assessment of the small approaching figure. Threat level, 0. But protocol was protocol, and Webb was not a man who abandoned protocol simply because the approaching party was wearing pigtails and a strawberry sweatshirt. He was about to step forward, about to insert himself gently between the child and his partner, with the standard courteous redirection he had given dozens of curious visitors before. Duke is working today. Maybe another time. He's a good boy, but we need to keep our distance. When Lily stopped. She stopped exactly 2 feet in front of Duke, with the precision of someone who had measured the distance and found it correct. And then she did something that Officer Webb, in 10 years of courthouse security detail, had never seen a child do when confronted with a large, official-looking police dog. She didn't reach out to pet him. She didn't bounce excitedly on her heels and ask if she could touch him. She didn't look around for her mother's permission or look up at Webb for his. She simply stood there, completely still, and looked at Duke with an attention so focused and so serious that it made her seem, for just a moment, decades older than she was. She tilted her head to the left. Duke's ear shifted. And then Lily raised one small index finger, not pointing at Duke's whole body, not gesturing vaguely in his direction, but pointing specifically, precisely, at the left side of his face, at the ear that had been carrying that faint asymmetry all morning, and she said 2 words. He's sad. The voice of a 3-year-old is not, under ordinary circumstances, the kind of voice that stops a hallway full of adults in their tracks. It is small and high and easily absorbed into the ambient noise of a busy public building. But something about the way Lily said those 2 words, the quiet certainty of them, the complete absence of performance or plea for attention, the tone of someone simply stating a fact they have observed and feel is important enough to share, gave them a weight that her small lungs had no business producing. The attorney 2 feet to Sandra's left stopped mid-sentence. The court clerk at the nearby desk looked up from her keyboard, with her fingers still resting on the keys. The couple on the bench across the hallway, who had been sitting in pointed silence for the past 20 minutes, both turned their heads at exactly the same moment. Even the security guard near the metal detector, a man whose professional specialty was appearing utterly unmoved by everything that happened around him, glanced over. The hallway didn't go completely silent. There was still noise further down the corridor, still the distant sound of a door opening and closing, still the faint hum of the building doing its ordinary business. But in the immediate space around Lily and Duke, something had shifted. The air felt different. The quality of attention in that 30-foot radius had changed entirely, the way a conversation changes when someone says something true that everyone else had been carefully avoiding. Officer Webb stood very still. He was looking at Lily, and then he was looking at Duke, and then he was looking at Lily again, and something was moving behind his eyes, not alarm exactly, not the sharp adrenaline response of a professional confronting a threat, but something slower and more uncomfortable than that. The particular feeling of a realization arriving that you are not entirely prepared to receive. Duke had not reacted to Lily's presence the way Webb would have expected. Duke's standard response to an unfamiliar person approaching within his space was a subtle increase in alertness. Not aggression, not anxiety, simply the heightened readiness of a working animal whose job required him to be aware of everything in his immediate environment. But Duke wasn't doing that. Duke was looking at Lily with his amber eyes completely steady, his body language carrying none of the professional watchfulness that Webb was accustomed to reading in him. He looked, and Webb would struggle to find a better word for it when he told this story later, like he had been seen. Like something had been acknowledged that he hadn't known how to ask to have acknowledged. And there it was again, that tilt. That small, almost invisible tilt of Duke's head to the left, the one Webb now realized he had been watching all morning without registering as anything other than normal movement, and which he was now, standing in this hallway with a 3-year-old's words still hanging in the air between them, suddenly unable to look at without concern. Sandra had reached Lily by then, one hand resting gently on her daughter's shoulder, her eyes moving between her child and the dog and the officer with an expression caught somewhere between apology and something that didn't quite have a name yet. She started to say something, some version of "I'm so sorry. She just loves dogs. We'll get out of your way," but Officer Webb raised one hand slightly, a quiet gesture that wasn't dismissive so much as asking for a moment. He needed a moment. He crouched down to Duke's level. He looked at his partner, really looked, the way you look at something when you've stopped seeing it through the filter of familiarity and are trying to see it fresh, trying to see it the way someone who had never seen it before might see it. He looked at the left ear. He looked at the set of muscles around the left eye. He watched Duke tilt his head, that same small degree to the left, and this time he didn't file it away as nothing. He reached out and very gently, very carefully, touched the base of Duke's left ear. Duke didn't flinch dramatically, but his eyes closed briefly, just for a second, just a single second, in a way that was not relaxation. Webb stood back up slowly. He looked at Sandra. He looked at Lily, who was still standing with her finger slightly raised, still watching Duke with that expression of complete and serious attention. And then he looked back at his partner, and the thing moving behind his eyes had finished its slow arrival and settled into something clear and certain and not entirely comfortable to feel. Lily was right. Around them, the hallway had begun to return to itself, conversations resuming, keyboards clicking, the ordinary business of a Tuesday morning reasserting itself over the extraordinary pause that a child's 2 words had created. People looked away, went back to their phones, their folders, their private worries. The moment was releasing, the way moments do. But for Officer Marcus Webb, standing in the marble corridor of the Hargrove County Courthouse with his hand still warm from touching his partner's ear, something had permanently shifted. Not the hallway, not the building, something in himself. He had been looking at Duke all morning. He had not been seeing him. There is a specific kind of shame that has nothing to do with wrongdoing. It is not the shame of a mistake made carelessly or a rule broken deliberately. It is quieter than that, and in many ways harder to sit with, the shame of realizing that something important was right in front of you every single day, and you looked at it without seeing it. You were present without being aware. You were close without being attentive. And it took someone else, someone with no training, no experience, no professional framework for noticing, to see what you had missed entirely. Officer Marcus Webb would not use the word shame when he talked about that morning in the months that followed. He was not the kind of man who used words like that easily or often. But anyone who sat across from him during those conversations and watched his face carefully would have recognized it. In the way his jaw tightened slightly when he got to the part about crouching down and touching Duke's ear, in the half-second pause before he answered questions about how long the signs had been there. In the particular way he looked at his hands sometimes when he was thinking about it, as if they had failed to do something they should have known to do without being asked. He had been Duke's handler for 2 years. 2 years of daily contact, daily observation, daily trust placed completely and without reservation in his ability to read his partner accurately. That was not a small thing. In the K-9 unit, the handler-dog relationship was considered one of the most important and demanding partnerships in law enforcement, not because of the paperwork or the certifications or the training hours logged, but because the entire effectiveness of a working dog depended on the handler's ability to know that animal deeply enough to catch the things that couldn't be communicated directly. Duke could not raise his hand and say something is wrong. Duke could not leave a note. Duke could not make an appointment and sit across a desk from someone and explain that he had been in increasing discomfort for the past 4 days and would appreciate some attention to the matter. Duke could only be Duke, showing up, doing his job, trusting his handler to notice. And Webb had not noticed. He sat with that fact in the car on the way to the veterinary clinic, Duke riding in the secured back section, the way he always did on transports, and Webb kept his eyes on the road and did not turn the radio on. He was running back through the past 4 days in his mind with the methodical focus of a man conducting an internal investigation on himself, and what he found there was not reassuring. There had been nothing obvious. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. There had been no dramatic signal he had ignored, no clear cry for help he had waved away. The signs had been subtle, genuinely subtle, the kind of subtle that existed right at the edge of visibility, close enough to normal that normal was the easier and more available interpretation. But he was also honest enough to acknowledge in the quiet of that car with the Tennessee highway unfolding ahead of him that subtle was exactly the kind of thing he was supposed to catch. That was the job, not the obvious things. Anyone could catch the obvious things. The job was the subtle things, the small deviations, the almost imperceptible shifts in behavior that meant something was changing beneath the surface. He had been trained for that. He had prided himself on that. And a 3-year-old girl who had known Duke for approximately 45 seconds had done it better than he had in 4 days. He glanced in the rearview mirror at Duke, who was sitting in his transport section with his characteristic composure, looking back at Webb with those clear amber eyes, and Webb felt the full, uncomfortable weight of it settle across his shoulders like weather. Dr. Patricia Osei had been the Hargrove County K-9 unit's primary veterinarian for 6 years. She was a compact, precise woman in her early 40s with close-cropped natural hair, and the kind of calm, unhurried manner in an examination room that immediately made both animals and their anxious handlers feel slightly less like the worst was inevitable. She had treated Duke twice before, once for a minor laceration sustained during a building search, once for a strained shoulder muscle after an agility training session, and she had always found him to be a model patient. Cooperative still, patient in a way that not all working dogs managed to be when they were outside their professional environment and in the unfamiliar territory of a clinical space. That Tuesday morning when Webb walked Duke through her clinic door and explained what had happened, and then, after a brief internal debate, explained exactly how it had been brought to his attention. Dr. Osa had listened without any change in her expression. She had looked at Webb for a moment when he finished, and then she had looked at Duke, and then she had said simply, "Let's have a look." The examination was thorough and unhurried. Dr. Osa worked from the outside in, beginning with a visual assessment that moved systematically across Duke's entire body before narrowing its focus. She noted the slight asymmetry in his ear positioning. She noted the tension pattern around his left eye. She watched him tilt his head and tracked the angle and frequency with the quiet attention of someone who was building a picture from details rather than waiting for a single conclusive sign to announce itself. She ran her gloved fingers carefully along the outer and inner structure of both ears, watching Duke's responses with the precision of someone reading very small print. When she reached the left ear canal, Duke's eyes closed again, that same brief, involuntary closing that Webb had felt like an accusation back in the courthouse hallway. Dr. Osa did not comment immediately. She continued her examination, unhurried, complete. Then she straightened, removed her gloves, and turned to face Webb with the even, direct manner of someone who believed that the people she spoke to deserved accurate information delivered without unnecessary decoration. The diagnosis was a moderate bacterial ear infection in the left canal, she explained. The kind that developed gradually, building in stages rather than arriving suddenly, which was precisely why it was so easy to miss in its early phases. The likely origin was moisture. Duke had participated in a water-based tracking exercise 4 days earlier, a training scenario that had involved navigating a shallow creek bed, and residual moisture in the ear canal had created the environment the bacteria needed to establish itself and begin its quiet, uncomfortable work. Duke had not been incapacitated. He had not been unable to function. He had shown up that morning and done his job with the same outward composure he always brought to it, because that was what he was trained to do and what his nature inclined him toward regardless of training. But the infection had been building pressure and heat and discomfort in a steady, escalating progression, and it had been doing so for 4 days while the world around him went about its business without any particular awareness that something was wrong. Dr. Osa paused here, and when she continued, her voice carried the careful weight of someone making sure a point was fully received rather than simply heard. Left untreated for another week, possibly less, depending on the rate of progression, the infection would have advanced to a stage where permanent damage to the inner ear became a genuine clinical possibility. In a working dog, inner ear damage of that magnitude was not a recoverable situation. It affected balance. It affected the acute directional hearing that made dogs like Duke functional in the field. It was, she said plainly, the kind of outcome that ended careers. She looked at Webb when she said that last part, not unkindly, just clearly. Webb nodded once. He looked at Duke, who was sitting on the examination table with his back straight and his eyes on Webb's face with the steady, uncomplicated attention he always gave his handler, as if nothing about this conversation concerned him particularly, as if he trusted completely that Webb had it handled. That trust landed on Webb like something physical. He thought about the courthouse hallway. He thought about Lily, 3 years old, pink sneakers, 2 words delivered with the quiet certainty of someone stating an observable fact. He thought about the 45 seconds it had taken her to see what 4 days had not revealed to him. He thought about what Dr. Osa had just said about careers ending, about permanent damage, about the narrow window between caught in time and too late. And he thought about how that window had been found not by training or experience or professional expertise, but by a child who had simply looked at a dog and paid attention to what she saw. He stayed in the waiting room chair while Dr. Osa began Duke's treatment. He didn't check his phone. He didn't make calls. He just sat in the particular silence of a man processing something that had rearranged a small but important part of how he understood himself and his work. The fluorescent light above him hummed steadily. Outside, A car moved through the clinic parking lot and was gone. Webb thought about all the things that got missed every day by people who were present but not truly paying attention. All the quiet signals that went unread because the people who should have been reading them were too familiar with the source, too accustomed to seeing what they expected to see rather than what was actually there. He thought about how expertise could sometimes be its own kind of blindness. How the more you knew, the more your knowledge created a filter between you and raw observation, a lens ground so thick with experience that it bent incoming light into the shape of what you already understood. A 3-year-old had no such filter. A 3-year-old had walked into a courthouse she had never visited, approached a dog she had never met, and in less than a minute had seen, clearly and without complication, exactly what was true. Webb leaned his head back against the waiting room wall and closed his eyes for a moment. He made himself a quiet, private promise sitting in that chair, the kind of promise that doesn't need to be spoken aloud to be binding. He was going to pay closer attention, not just to Duke, to everything. He was going to look at the things he thought he knew and make himself see them fresh, make himself see them the way someone who had never seen them before might see them, unfiltered and without assumption. It seemed like the least he could do. It seemed like the thing a little girl in pink sneakers had just taught him, without trying, without knowing, in the middle of a courthouse hallway on a gray Tuesday morning in October. There are children who are born into the world with a particular kind of sensitivity that has no clean scientific name and resists every attempt to explain it away as coincidence or imagination. It is not a supernatural thing. It has nothing to do with magic or mystery or any of the comfortable, dismissive frameworks people reach for when they encounter something they cannot immediately categorize. It is something quieter and more grounded than that. It is the capacity to feel the emotional and physical reality of another living creature, so completely, so personally, that the boundary between their experience and your own becomes genuinely thin. Not dissolved, children like this are not confused about where they end and the world begins. The boundary is simply more permeable than it is in most people. More information gets through. More signals are received and processed and taken seriously rather than filtered out as irrelevant noise. Lily Kelly's had been this kind of child from the very beginning. Sandra could trace it back further than Biscuit, further back than most of the stories she told reporters and neighbors in the days following the courthouse incident. She could trace it back to when Lily was 14 months old and had not yet developed enough language to communicate anything complex, and yet had crawled across the living room floor to where Sandra was sitting after a particularly difficult phone call, and had pressed both small palms flat against her mother's cheeks, and looked at her with an expression of such clear and uncomplicated compassion that Sandra had burst into tears she hadn't even known she was holding. Lily had not cried in response. She had not become distressed by her mother's distress the way many young children do, absorbing the emotion of the room and amplifying it back. She had simply stayed there, both hands on Sandra's face, steady and present, as if she understood that what was needed in that moment was not matching emotion but anchoring attention. Sandra had told that story to her own mother on the phone the next day, and her mother had said something like, "Oh, she's just a baby. She doesn't know what she's doing. Bobbies do things like that." And Sandra had said, "Yes, of course, you're probably right," because that was the easier thing to say, and because she didn't yet have the confidence in her own observation to insist on what she had clearly seen. But she had known. Even then, with Lily barely old enough to walk steadily, Sandra had known that her daughter was paying attention to the world in a way that was going to matter. Biscuit had come into their lives when Lily was 18 months old, a golden retriever with a broad, perpetually smiling face, and the kind of uncomplicated, full-body joy that golden retrievers seem to carry as a genetic inheritance, as if happiness is simply their default operating state, and they see no reason to deviate from it. Sandra had adopted him from a rescue organization, partly for company during a difficult period of her life, and partly because she had grown up with dogs and believed, deeply and without reservation, that children raised alongside animals grew up with something essential that children raised without them sometimes had to learn the hard way later. She had been right about that, though perhaps not in the way she had anticipated. Lily and Biscuit had formed the kind of bond that adults watch children form with animals and feel simultaneously delighted by and vaguely envious of, the kind of total, uncomplicated, mutually adoring connection that exists without negotiation or condition, or any of the complications that human relationships accumulate over time. Lily had learned to walk steadily in part by grabbing Biscuit's fur and using him as a mobile support structure, which Biscuit had tolerated with the patient dignity of a creature that understood his role perfectly. Biscuit had slept at the foot of Lily's bed every night from the week they brought him home. Lily had, at various points, attempted to share her breakfast with him, dress him in her doll's hat, and read to him from picture books, and Biscuit had received all of these attentions with the same warm, golden equanimity he brought to everything. When Lily was 2.5, Biscuit got sick. It did not happen dramatically. There was no single moment of obvious collapse, no sudden alarming symptom that sent them rushing to the emergency vet in the middle of the night. It happened the way illness often happens in animals, gradually, quietly, in small increments that were individually easy to rationalize away as nothing significant. Biscuit was eating a little less. Biscuit was sleeping a little more. Biscuit's coat, which had always been thick and gleaming, seemed somehow less luminous, as if the light inside him had been turned down by a single degree. Sandra had noticed these things, and had told herself what people tell themselves when they are not ready to confront the possibility of loss, that he was just having a slow week, that the weather was making him lethargic, that he was getting a little older, and this was simply what older dogs did. Then one morning, approximately 3 weeks before the veterinarian confirmed the diagnosis, Sandra had come into the living room to find Lily on Biscuit's dog bed beside him. This was not unusual. Lily spent time on Biscuit's bed regularly, to Biscuit's evident satisfaction. What was unusual was the expression on Lily's face. She had both arms around Biscuit's neck, her cheek pressed against the top of his head, and she was looking up at Sandra with an expression that Sandra had never seen on her daughter's face before and would never entirely forget afterward. It was not fear exactly, and it was not sadness exactly, but it was something that contained both of those things and something else besides, a quality of knowing that had no business being on a 2-year-old's face. Lily had looked at her mother and said, in the careful, deliberate way of a child choosing words with unusual care, "Biscuit hurts inside, Mama." Sandra had felt the sentence land somewhere below her sternum. She had taken Biscuit to the veterinarian the following morning. The diagnosis had been hepatic disease, liver deterioration that had been progressing silently for an unknown period and had reached a stage that made the prognosis, the veterinarian explained gently, not optimistic. They had managed it as well as it could be managed for 6 weeks. Biscuit had passed away on a Tuesday evening in late April, at home, on his own bed, with Lily beside him and Sandra's hand on his back. Lily had grieved in the way that very young children grieve, intensely, and then, it seemed, suddenly and incompletely, the way grief moves through people who have not yet learned to organize it into a sustained shape. She had cried for 2 days with a depth that felt disproportionate to her age and was not. She had asked for Biscuit at bedtime for 2 weeks. She had once brought his empty food bowl to Sandra and looked at it for a long moment, and then set it carefully back on the kitchen floor and walked away without saying anything. And that small, wordless gesture had broken Sandra more completely than the crying had. And then gradually Lily had moved forward, the way children do, the way people must. But something had shifted in her, and Sandra could see it clearly in the months that followed. Lily had always been perceptive, always been unusually attuned to the emotional atmosphere of a room. After Biscuit, That attunement deepened and extended and seemed to focus itself with new intention, particularly toward animals. Every dog they encountered on walks received Lily's complete and serious attention, not the excited, grabbing attention of a child who simply loved dogs, but a slower, more careful regard, as if she were checking something, as if she were making sure, as if losing Biscuit had installed in her a quiet, permanent responsibility to notice what others might not, to look carefully at every animal she met and ask the wordless question, "Are you all right? Is anything being missed? Is there something here that needs to be seen?" Sandra had thought about this a great deal in the days after the courthouse. She had thought about what it meant that her daughter's grief had not hardened into avoidance, had not made Lily wary of attachment or reluctant to engage with animals for fear of losing them again. Instead, it had done the opposite. It had made her more present, more attentive, more genuinely available to what was actually in front of her rather than what she expected or hoped to find. Loss had not closed Lily down. It had opened her further. There were adults, many adults, people who had lived decades longer and experienced losses far greater, who never managed that particular transformation, who let grief build walls rather than windows, who responded to the pain of losing something beloved by deciding, on some level beneath conscious thought, to simply stop looking so closely at the things they loved. Because if you didn't look too closely, you might not notice when they started to fade. And if you didn't notice, you might be spared the specific agony of watching it happen. Lily had gone the other way entirely. She had looked at Biscuit until the very end. She had been present for all of it. And rather than protecting herself from that experience by closing her eyes a little, she had responded by deciding again, below the level of conscious decision, in the wordless way that very young children make their most important choices, to keep them open. To look at every living thing she cared about with the full, clear, undefended attention that Biscuit had deserved and received. Duke had simply been the next living thing to stand before that attention. He had been a courthouse security dog to everyone else in that hallway, official, trained, professional, part of the scenery. To Lily, he had been a creature with a face and eyes and a body that was telling a story, and she had read that story in under a minute because she had not brought any assumptions about what the story should be. She had not seen a decorated K-9 officer with an impressive service record. She had not seen a symbol of authority or a professional instrument of law enforcement. She had seen a dog, she had looked at his face, she had noticed what was there. 2 words, simple, direct, and completely true. Sandra, in the weeks that followed, would find herself thinking about what it would mean if more people moved through the world the way her daughter did, with that quality of open, unfiltered, genuinely present attention. Not just toward animals, toward each other, toward the colleagues and partners and family members who showed up every day doing their jobs, carrying their discomfort quietly, tilting their heads slightly in the direction of something that hurt, trusting that someone who was paying attention would notice. She thought about how many things went unseen every single day, not because the signs weren't there, but because the people in the best position to see them had grown too familiar with the source, had stopped looking fresh, had let the comfortable expectation of sameness replace the actual, real, specific reality of what was standing right in front of them. She thought about Biscuit. She thought about Duke. She thought about her daughter, 3 years old, who had walked into a courthouse she'd never been in before and looked at a dog she'd never met and seen the truth of his condition before anyone who had known him for years had managed to do it. And she thought, that is not a small thing. That is not luck or coincidence or the charming accident of a child's unfiltered perception. That is something worth learning from, something worth carrying. Lily, for her part, had moved on by lunchtime. She had eaten her sandwich and asked for apple juice and wanted to know if they could get a new dog. Sandra had said maybe and meant it a little more than she expected to. Outside the courthouse window, the October sky had shifted from gray to the particular pale blue that only appears after clouds move through, and the afternoon light had come in through the windows and lay in long, clean rectangles across the marble floor, warming the cold stone into something that almost resembled welcome. The Hargrove County K-9 Veterinary Clinic sat on a quiet stretch of Millbrook Road, about 4 miles east of the courthouse, tucked between a feed supply store and a small family-owned hardware shop that had been operating under the same name since 1971. The clinic was not a large building, a single-story structure with white painted brick, a dark green awning above the entrance, and a small parking area out front that rarely held more than 4 or 5 vehicles at a time. There was nothing about its exterior that suggested anything particularly significant happened inside. It looked, from the outside, exactly like what it was, a working veterinary facility in a working county, practical and unpretentious, built for function rather than impression. But inside those plain white walls, over the course of 6 years, some genuinely important work had been done. The clinic had been established specifically to serve the K-9 units of Hargrove County and 3 neighboring counties, filling a gap that had existed for years. Working dogs were not ordinary patients, and their medical needs required a level of specialized knowledge and equipment that general veterinary practices were not always equipped to provide. The dogs that came through those doors were athletes and professionals, animals whose physical condition was directly tied to their ability to perform jobs that sometimes meant the difference between a case solved and a case cold, between a missing person found and a missing person never coming home. Their care required precision, experience, and the kind of deep familiarity with working dog physiology that only came from years of concentrated focus on exactly that population. Dr. Patricia Osei had built that expertise deliberately and over a long time. She had grown up in Accra, Ghana, the daughter of a veterinarian father who had taken her on house calls from the time she was old enough to sit in the front seat of his truck without a booster, and who had taught her, through years of quiet example rather than formal instruction, that the most important skill in veterinary medicine was not technical knowledge, though technical knowledge was essential and non-negotiable, but observation. The ability to look at an animal and receive all the information it was offering without imposing your expectations onto what you saw. Animals, her father had told her once, driving back from a farm call on a red dust road as the sun went down ahead of them, are always telling you the truth. The question is whether you are listening carefully enough to hear it. She had carried that through her undergraduate biology degree in London, through her veterinary program at the Royal Veterinary College, through her residency specialization in working animal medicine in Virginia, and into every examination room she had occupied for the past 12 years. It had shaped not just how she practiced but how she thought, the fundamental, unshakable conviction that the animal on her table was always communicating, always providing information, and that her job was to be a good enough listener to receive it accurately. Duke, she would say later, had been communicating clearly. The communication had simply been directed at someone who was not, in that particular instance, listening carefully enough, until a 3-year-old child had listened instead. When Webb had walked Duke through the clinic door that Tuesday morning, Dr. Osei had been in the middle of updating post-treatment notes from her previous patient. She had looked up, taken in Webb's expression and Duke's posture in a single practice glance, and set her pen down without finishing her sentence. Whatever the note said could wait. Something more immediate had just walked into her clinic. Webb had explained the situation in the direct, sequentially organized way of someone with a law enforcement background. The training exercise 4 days ago, the water exposure, the subtle behavioral changes he now recognized in retrospect but had not caught in real time, and then the courthouse, and Lily, and the 2 words. When he got to that part, he had paused for just a fraction of a second longer than the rest of the account, as if the pause itself was an acknowledgement of something he was still processing. Dr. Osei had listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she had looked at Duke for a long, quiet moment with the particular quality of attention that was, in its own way, remarkably similar to what Lily had brought to the same subject an hour earlier in a courthouse hallway, complete, unhurried, and entirely without preconception. Then she had said, "Let's have a look." The examination table in Dr. Osai's primary treatment room was padded, and low enough to be accessible without lifting, which mattered for larger working dogs whose stress response to clinical environments could be complicated by the disorientation of being hoisted onto a high surface. Duke had stepped up onto it with the cooperative composure that had always made him an unusually straightforward patient, settling into a standing position and turning his head slightly to track Dr. Osai as she moved around him, his amber eyes steady and calm, and carrying that characteristic quality of a dog that had decided to trust the situation he was in. Dr. Os began at a distance, the way her father had taught her, observing the whole animal first before narrowing focus to the specific concern that had brought the animal in, because sometimes the specific concern was connected to something else entirely, and beginning with the part rather than the whole meant you risked missing the connection. She walked a slow circle around Duke, her eyes moving across his posture, his weight distribution, the alignment of his spine, the set of his muscles, the quality of his coat. She watched him breathe. She watched him hold his head. She noted the ear asymmetry immediately and filed it as significant without yet drawing a conclusion from it. Then she moved closer. She ran her hands along his neck and shoulders with light, even pressure, watching his response to touch in different areas. She examined his eyes with a small light, checking the clarity of the lenses and the responsiveness of the pupils. She opened his mouth and looked at his gums and teeth with the efficient thoroughness of someone who had done this thousands of times and never stopped doing it carefully. She checked his lymph nodes, his abdomen, his limbs, his paws. And then last she came to the ears. She examined the right ear first, which was standard practice, established the baseline of the unaffected side before moving to the side that was showing signs, so that the comparison was fresh and immediate rather than theoretical. The right ear was clean, healthy, with the pink interior and appropriate wax levels of a well-maintained working dog's ear. She noted it, moved smoothly to the left. The difference was not dramatic to the naked eye. The interior of the left ear showed mild redness along the canal wall, a slight increase in discharge that was darker in color than it should have been, and a faint but detectable warmth that her gloved fingertips registered before her diagnostic light confirmed the inflammation beneath the surface. She probed carefully, gently, watching Duke's face throughout, watching his eyes, the set of his jaw, the muscles of his forehead. And when she reached the specific point of maximum inflammation in the deep canal, Duke's eyes closed in that brief, involuntary way that was not relaxation and was not sleep, but was the controlled, disciplined response of an animal that had been trained not to flinch and was managing that training right at its limit. Dr. Osai straightened. She removed her gloves. She turned to Webb and delivered her findings with the clear, unembellished directness that had always been her communication style in clinical settings, not cold, but precise, because precision was what the situation required and what the person standing across from her deserved. Moderate bacterial otitis externa, progressing toward the middle ear. Bacterial infection of the left ear canal, origin almost certainly the moisture exposure from the creek bed exercise 4 days prior. The bacteria had found a warm, damp environment and had done exactly what bacteria do in warm, damp environments, established themselves, multiplied, and begun the steady process of causing damage to the tissue around them. The infection was currently contained to the outer and early middle canal, but was showing signs of advancement that, left uninterrupted, would have continued its progression inward. She paused here, and the pause had weight. The inner ear, she explained, was not a recoverable territory in the way that the outer canal was. Inner ear damage in working dogs affected the vestibular system, the intricate biological machinery responsible for balance, spatial orientation, and the acute directional hearing that made a dog like Duke capable of doing what Duke did. A dog with compromised vestibular function could not perform search and rescue operations with reliable accuracy, could not track in low visibility conditions, could not function in the precise, high-stakes way that his certifications and his service record represented. The damage, once done, could not be undone with antibiotics or surgery or time. It was simply done. She looked at Webb steadily when she said, "Another 5 to 7 days, and they would very likely have been discussing early medical retirement." Webb sat down in the chair beside the examination table without saying anything. He looked at Duke, who looked back at him with the same steady, trusting attention he always gave his handler, entirely unaware of or entirely unbothered by the specific weight of what had just been said about his future. Duke was present. Duke was calm. Duke was, as always, paying attention to the thing directly in front of him rather than the things that might have been. Webb thought he could stand to learn something from that. Treatment began immediately and proceeded with the organized efficiency of a clinic that had handled these situations before. Dr. Ose flushed the ear canal thoroughly with a medicated solution, removing the accumulated discharge and debris that had been providing the bacteria with both material and cover. She applied a topical antibiotic preparation directly to the canal wall and prescribed a course of oral antibiotics to address any systemic component of the infection. She gave Webb detailed instructions for the follow-up care that would be required twice daily for the next 10 days. The cleaning procedure, the medication schedule, the signs to watch for that would indicate either improvement or the need to return sooner than the scheduled follow-up appointment. She also gave him something else, delivered at the end of the appointment as he was clipping Duke's leash back on, and Duke was stepping down from the examination table with the dignified composure of a patient who had behaved impeccably and was aware of it. She said, "The child who noticed this, she has something worth paying attention to. Some people are just built to see what others miss. You might want to tell her that what she did mattered." Webb had looked at Dr. Osai for a moment. Then he had nodded once in the way of a man who has received a piece of information and intends to do something concrete with it. Duke would be restricted to light administrative duty for 5 days, Dr. Osai confirmed. No field work, no training exercises, no environments that might introduce additional moisture or stress to the healing canal. He would need to be monitored closely, his behavior tracked daily for any signs of the infection deepening rather than resolving. The follow-up appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Webb drove back toward the department with Duke in the back, and Dr. Osai's words moving through his mind, alongside everything else that had accumulated there since 9:47 that morning. The Tennessee countryside moved past the windows in its October colors, the deep red of sweetgums, the yellow of hickories, the particular amber of oaks that hadn't quite decided to let go yet. Duke was going to be all right. That was the thing that mattered most. Duke was going to be all right because a 3-year-old girl had walked into a courthouse with her mother's hand in hers and a pink sweatshirt on her back, and had looked at a dog she had never met and told the truth about what she saw. Webb made a mental note to write a letter. He was going to make sure Lily Kelly's knew that her 2 words had done something real, something that lasted, something that a working dog with a career worth saving and a handler who owed him better attention would carry forward into years of service that might otherwise have ended on a Tuesday morning in October before anyone had understood what was being lost. The clinic disappeared in the rearview mirror. The road ahead was clear and long and lit with the pale gold of an afternoon that had decided, after all, to be beautiful. Duke rested his chin on his paws in the back and closed his eyes. Both ears, for the first time in 4 days, pointed in exactly the same direction. Courtroom number 4 in the Hargrove County Courthouse was not a large room. It held 2 counsel tables, a judge's bench elevated just enough to communicate authority without theatrical excess, a jury box that sat empty on non-trial days, and 2 rows of wooden benches in the gallery for observers. The walls were paneled in dark oak that had been refinished sometime in the late 90s, and had since settled into a warm, amber tone that was, by considerable margin, the most welcoming surface in the entire building. A single window on the east wall let in a narrow column of afternoon light that moved slowly across the floor as the hours passed, like a quiet clock that nobody had officially authorized, but nobody had thought to remove either. Judge Eleanor Marsh had presided over Courtroom 4 for 11 years. She was 63 years old, silver-haired, with reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, and a manner on the bench that managed to be simultaneously unhurried and completely in command. The manner of someone who had long since stopped needing to perform authority because she had simply become it. She had seen thousands of cases move through her courtroom in 11 years. Family law cases, she had told a colleague once over coffee in the break room, were the most human thing the legal system ever attempted, and also, frequently, the most painful, because they involved taking the most complicated and emotionally dense situations in people's lives and asking the blunt, imprecise instrument of legal process to resolve them. She approached every family case with the awareness that the outcome would matter long after the paperwork was filed and the building had closed for the night. Sandra's custody case had been assigned to Judge Marsh 3 months earlier, and the judge had reviewed the documentation thoroughly before the hearing began. Claire Merritt, Sandra's attorney, had prepared an exceptionally organized and well-evidenced filing, the kind of filing that did not leave significant questions unanswered or significant facts unsupported. The opposing counsel had submitted a competent counterfiling, but the weight of evidence and documentation had tilted clearly in Sandra's direction from the moment the first page was read, and anyone who had been inside Courtroom 4 long enough to read Judge Marsh's expressions would have recognized, by approximately 40 minutes into the proceedings, that the outcome was not genuinely uncertain. The hearing lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. Judge Marsh granted Sandra primary custody of Lily, with a structured and generous visitation schedule for Lily's father that acknowledged his role in his daughter's life, while recognizing the stability and continuity that Sandra's primary caregiving had provided. She read the decision in the measured, clear tones she used for all her rulings, not cold, not warm, simply accurate, each sentence chosen to be understood rather than admired. When she finished, she looked at both parties over her reading glasses with an expression that said, without words, "This is what is best for the child. Everything else is secondary to that." Claire Merritt touched Sandra's arm lightly under the counsel table when the ruling was read. Sandra nodded, her eyes fixed on the middle distance in the way of someone who has been braced for a long time and is not yet certain how to stop bracing. Her hands, she realized, were trembling slightly, not from distress, but from the physical release of tension that had been held in her body for so many months that her muscles had apparently forgotten how to exist without it. She pressed them flat on the table and breathed slowly and deliberately, the way she had practiced in the parking lot before coming inside that morning. It was over. The thing she had prepared for and dreaded and hoped for through 11 months of paperwork and attorney meetings and nights lying awake running scenarios through her mind. It was over, and it had gone the way she had needed it to go, and Lily was going to come home with her tonight and every night that followed, and the folder on the table in front of her, the manila folder with the custody documents and the pediatrician's letter and the preschool teacher's notes, had done its job. She should have felt in that moment that the folder was the most important thing that had happened to her in that building today. She didn't, not entirely, not even close. The phone call to her sister Angela came from the courthouse steps, while Claire Merritt was inside gathering documents, and the afternoon sun was doing its best against an October sky that kept threatening clouds. Sandra sat on the top step with her coat pulled around her and her phone pressed to her ear, and Angela answered on the second ring the way she always did when she knew something important was happening, as if she had been sitting beside the phone waiting. Sandra told her about the ruling first, because that was the right order, because That was the thing that had required 11 months of her life and deserved to be the headline. Angela cried. Sandra almost cried. They stayed on the line for a moment, just breathing together across the distance, the way sisters do when words are not quite adequate to the size of the feeling. And then Sandra said, "But that's not actually the most important thing that happened today." And she told Angela about the hallway, about Duke, about Lily walking away from the bench with that particular determined walk, about the 2 words and the silence that had followed them, and Officer Webb crouching down beside his dog, and the way the whole corridor had held its breath for a moment before resuming its ordinary business. She told it the way you tell a story that you are still in the process of understanding, not with the polished narrative arc of something you have had time to process and organize, but with the slightly breathless quality of someone reporting from the middle of an experience that has not yet fully revealed what it means. Angela was quiet for a moment when Sandra finished. Then she said, "Of course she did. Of course Lily did." And Sandra had laughed, a short, real laugh that released something in her chest she hadn't known was compressed, because yes, of course. Of course, Lily had walked into a courthouse full of adults and professionals and people with credentials and experience and years of accumulated knowledge, and had seen the thing that none of them had seen, because Lily had never learned not to look. The story did not stay between the 2 sisters for long. Angela told her husband, who mentioned it to a colleague. Claire Merritt told the story at dinner that evening, and her husband posted a version of it to his social media account the following morning. A courthouse clerk who had been standing near the water fountain at the relevant moment told her mother, who told 3 people at her book club. The local newspaper, the Hargrove Gazette, ran a short piece 4 days after the hearing under the headline that someone in the editorial meeting had clearly been quite pleased with. Little girl, big instincts. Toddler's 2 words may have saved K-9 officer's career. The piece was accurate in its facts and generous in its tone, and it was shared widely enough that the story reached people in 3 neighboring counties and eventually several states. Officer Webb read the newspaper piece on his front porch on a Thursday morning with a cup of coffee in his hand, and Duke lying across his feet in the particular way Duke had of lying across people's feet, as if physical contact was simply the most efficient way to maintain awareness of his handler's location. Webb read the article twice. He found it accurate but insufficient, not because the reporter had gotten anything wrong, but because no newspaper piece could fully carry the specific weight of what he had felt in that waiting room chair at the veterinary clinic, what he had felt when Dr. Ose had said the words early retirement, what he had felt looking at Duke on the examination table with those steady amber eyes trusting him completely. He had been thinking about the letter for 3 days. He was not by nature or by practice a man who wrote letters. He sent texts and emails and the occasional terse departmental memo, but letters handwritten, considered, sent through the mail in an envelope were not part of his regular communication repertoire. But a text felt wrong for this. An email felt wrong. What had happened in that courthouse hallway and what it had set in motion and what might have been lost without it, that deserved paper. That deserved the time it took to choose words carefully and write them by hand and seal them in an envelope and put a stamp on the corner and walk it to the mailbox and let it travel the slow, physical way toward the person it was meant for. He had written 4 drafts before he was satisfied. The final version was short, a single index card, because Webb had discovered over the course of 4 drafts that the shorter he made it, the more it said. He had written, "Your daughter may have saved my partner's career. There aren't enough words for that. Duke is doing well and will be back on duty soon. Please tell Lily that what she did mattered more than she will understand for a long time and maybe exactly as much as she already does. Thank you, Officer Marcus Webb." He had folded it twice, put it in a plain white envelope with Sandra's address on the front, obtained through the appropriate departmental channels, a request that his supervisor had approved with the comment that it was the least bureaucratic thing Webb had done in his entire career, and mailed it on a Friday afternoon. Sandra received it the following Monday. She was standing at the kitchen counter, opening the day's mail with Lily at her feet eating crackers and watching a cartoon on the tablet propped against the fruit bowl. And she had opened the envelope without particular expectation, reading the index card once quickly and then again slowly. And on the second reading, she had set it down on the counter and pressed both hands flat on either side of it and looked at the window for a long moment. Lily looked up from her crackers. She studied her mother's face with the careful attention she brought to faces when something important was moving across them. "Mama okay?" she asked. Sandra looked down at her daughter, at the dark eyes that saw everything, at the small face that had walked into a courthouse full of adult preoccupations and professional assumptions, and had cut through all of it in under a minute with nothing but honest attention and 2 true words. "Yes, baby," Sandra said. "Mama is very okay." She picked up the index card and read it one more time. Then she did something that surprised her slightly, as the best instincts sometimes do. She walked to the kitchen drawer where she kept important documents, the insurance cards, the lease, Lily's birth certificate, and she put the index card inside. Not in the manila folder which was sitting on the shelf in the hallway closet, its purpose served, and its season complete. In the drawer with the things that mattered permanently. The things that were part of the record of a life. Because that was what it was. Not a courthouse document, not a legal filing or an official record or a piece of the machinery of judgment. Just a handwritten note from a man who had learned something important about paying attention, sent to the mother of the child who had taught him. A small piece of paper that contained, in its few careful sentences, something true and lasting about what it means to really see the things that are right in front of you. The cartoon played on. Lily ate another cracker. Outside the kitchen window, the October afternoon was doing what October afternoons in Tennessee do when they decide to be generous, turning the light gold and long and casting shadows that stretched across the yard in warm, unhurried lines. The verdict that had been delivered in Courtroom 4 of the Hargrove County Courthouse that Tuesday would shape the structure of Lily's life for years to come. It was important. It was the right outcome. It was the thing Sandra had worked and hoped and prepared for, and it had been delivered by a fair judge in a fair process, and it would hold. But the thing Sandra found herself returning to in the quiet moments of the weeks that followed, late at night after Lily was asleep, or early in the morning before the day had properly started, was not the ruling. It was a hallway, a dog, a small finger raised with complete certainty, 2 words delivered without hesitation or performance by a child who had simply looked at something and told the truth about what she saw. That was the thing that felt, in some way she couldn't entirely articulate but didn't need to, like the more important verdict. Spring came to Hargrove County the way it always did, not all at once, not with dramatic announcement, but gradually and then suddenly, the way the best things arrive. One morning in early March, the Bradford pear trees along Millbrook Road were bare and gray against a pale sky, and then a week later they were white with blossom, and the air had changed from the clean, cold bite of winter into something softer and more complicated, carrying the smell of thawed earth and new grass, and the particular green freshness that only exists in that narrow window between the last frost and the first real heat. The days stretched longer. The light came back with the unhurried confidence of something that has always known it would return. Duke came back too. He had returned to full active duty 6 weeks after that Tuesday morning in October, cleared by Dr. Ose, with a follow-up examination that confirmed complete resolution of the infection and full restoration of his hearing and vestibular function. The treatment had worked exactly as it was supposed to work, efficiently and thoroughly, leaving no residual damage and no lasting compromise to the systems that made Duke what he was. His first day back in the field, Webb had watched him work a narcotics detection scenario with the same focused, unhurried precision that had always defined him, and had felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't fully realized had been tight since October. Duke was whole. Duke was back. The thing that might have been lost had not been lost, and the awareness of that near miss lived in Webb now as something useful rather than something painful. A permanent reminder of the cost of familiarity, the danger of seeing what you expect rather than what is. The department had marked Duke's return informally, the way law enforcement agencies mark things that matter but don't fit neatly into official ceremony. A brief acknowledgement at roll call, a cake in the break room that someone had ordered from the bakery on 5th Street, and that had a fondant paw print on top that the night shift dispatcher had photographed and posted to the department's social media page. The post had gotten more engagement than anything the department had shared in 2 years, which said something either about the public's appetite for good news or about Duke specifically, whose photograph had a quality that translated even through a phone screen. That steadiness, that calm authority, those amber eyes that looked at the camera the way he looked at everything, with complete and level attention. Webb had shown the post to Duke, which he understood was not a rational thing to do and did anyway, holding the phone screen down to Duke's level in the break room. Duke had looked at the image of himself with the same equanimity he brought to everything else, and then looked back up at Webb as if to say, "Was there something you needed, or are we done here?" Webb had laughed, a real, unguarded laugh of the kind that only his closest colleagues ever heard, and put the phone back in his pocket. The birthday party was Sandra's idea, but the invitation to Officer Webb and Duke had been Lily's. Lily was turning 4 in the second week of April, a milestone she had been tracking with considerable intensity since approximately the middle of February, when she had announced at breakfast one morning that her birthday was coming, and she wanted a cake with strawberries and a dog at her party. Sandra had assumed, initially, that the dog request was a general wish, the expression of Lily's ongoing and enthusiastic desire for a canine companion that had been a consistent feature of her conversation since Biscuit's passing. She had started to explain, gently, that bringing a dog to a birthday party required someone who owned the dog and was willing to bring it, when Lily had looked at her with the expression of someone whose meaning has been comprehensively missed and said, with patient clarity, "Duke, I want Duke at my party." Sandra had paused. She had looked at her daughter, this small, serious, entirely certain person in her pajamas with syrup on her chin, and had thought, not for the first time, that there was something almost vertiginous about being the parent of a child who knew her own mind this completely. She had called Officer Webb the following morning. Webb had said yes before she finished asking. He had said it with the immediate, unqualified certainty of a man who had been looking for an appropriate way to close a particular loop and had just been handed one. The party was held in the backyard of Sandra's apartment complex, a modest but pleasant outdoor space that the building's landlord permitted tenants to use for gatherings, with a wooden deck, a patch of grass that had come back thick and green with the spring, and a line of azalea bushes along the back fence that had chosen the second week of April to be in full, extravagant bloom. Pink and white and the particular vivid magenta that azaleas produce when they have decided to make an occasion of themselves. Sandra had strung paper lanterns between 2 posts near the deck and set up a folding table with a strawberry cake and juice boxes, and the small paper plates printed with cartoon dogs that she had found at the party supply store and purchased without deliberating, because of course. There were 8 children at the party, ranging in age from 2.5 to 5, and they had reached the loud, slightly chaotic phase of mid-party energy when the gate at the side of the yard opened, and Officer Webb came through in plain clothes, dark jeans and a gray Henley, looking somewhat less imposing than he did in full department uniform, but carrying himself with the same settled, quiet authority that seemed to be simply part of his physical composition, with Duke walking at his left side on a loose leash. Head up, ears forward, amber eyes moving across the yard with the calm, systematic attention that was, in every environment, his natural state. The children stopped. This was not the gradual, rippling quiet that moves through a group of adults when something unexpected enters the room. This was the instantaneous, total silence that only groups of small children can produce. A silence that happens not because anyone has decided to be quiet, but because every available unit of attention has been simultaneously captured by a single thing and redirected entirely toward it. 8 children stood in various positions across the backyard, juice boxes and paper plates momentarily forgotten, every face turned toward the gate. Duke surveyed the yard with the measured patience of a professional who had been in many unfamiliar environments, and understood that patience was almost always the correct initial response. Then from across the yard, Lily moved. She had been standing near the cake table when the gate opened, a half-eaten strawberry in her hand, wearing a white dress with small yellow flowers that Sandra had pressed the night before, and that had already sustained a juice stain on the left sleeve that Sandra had decided not to care about. She saw Duke come through the gate, and something in her entire body changed, not with the electric bouncing excitement that children sometimes produce around dogs, the excitement that can startle animals and complicate introductions, but with something calmer and more directional than that. She became still for just a moment, the way she had been still in the courthouse hallway, gathering herself. And then she walked across the grass toward Duke, with the same deliberate, unhurried purpose that Sandra had come to recognize as the signature of her daughter's most important movements. Webb saw her coming. He felt Duke feel her coming, that slight shift in his partner's posture that wasn't alertness exactly but was awareness, the recognition of a specific presence rather than simply a new element in the environment. Webb loosened his grip on the leash incrementally, not releasing it but making it clear that he was not going to be an obstacle. Lily stopped in front of Duke, 3 feet, 2 feet. She looked at him with those dark eyes that saw everything, and Duke looked back at her with his amber eyes that missed nothing, and for a moment the two of them simply regarded each other in the middle of a backyard full of children and paper lanterns and azalea blooms, with the complete, mutual, uncomplicated attention of two beings that had already, in a marble corridor 6 months ago, established something real between them. Then Duke did something that made every adult standing around that yard go very quiet in a way that felt entirely different from the children's silence. He lowered himself onto the grass, not the alert, poised position of a working dog at rest, not the watchful crouch of an animal uncertain about its environment. He went all the way down, fully, completely, his chest and belly on the cool April grass, his front legs extended, his head coming to rest with unhurried certainty directly on top of Lily's small shoes. He closed his eyes. Sandra pressed her hand to her mouth. Angela, who had driven up from Nashville for the party and was standing near the azalea bushes with her phone half raised for a photograph she now found herself unable to take, because the moment felt too real for documentation, looked at her sister, and then looked back at the dog and the child, and felt something move through her that she would describe afterward, imprecisely but honestly, as the feeling of watching something be completed. Webb stood with the slack leash in his hand and looked at his partner. This decorated, disciplined, exceptional animal who had tracked missing children through blizzards and cornered armed suspects in parking garages and helped crack narcotics cases, and done it all with a composure that made experienced law enforcement officers feel humbled, lying in the grass of a birthday party with his chin on a 4-year-old's shoes, eyes closed, entirely at peace. As if this were the most natural conclusion to a long and effortful journey. As if this specific place, this specific moment, this specific child's feet were exactly where he had been heading all along without knowing it. Lily reached down and placed both hands on Duke's head with a gentleness so deliberate it looked like something practiced, though it wasn't. She scratched behind his ears, both ears, the left one included, the one that had carried the quiet distress that had gone unread by everyone except her, and Duke's tail moved once against the grass. Slow, certain, content. The other children began to drift closer, cautiously at first, and then, with the growing confidence of children who are reading the energy of a situation and finding it safe. Webb managed the introductions with the patient, practiced ease of a handler who had done this many times, guiding small hands to the correct position, explaining in simple terms what Duke liked and what Duke didn't, answering the question of whether Duke could eat birthday cake. He could not, with a solemnity that the questioner, a 3-year-old in a dinosaur shirt, found entirely satisfying. But Lily stayed where she was, standing with Duke's head on her shoes, both hands resting on his warm fur, watching the party continue around them with the expression of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be and knows it. Webb drove home that evening on the same road he always took, Duke in the back, the Tennessee spring darkening around him into a soft purple dusk that settled over the fields and tree lines with the unhurried grace of a day that had been good and knew it. He had the window down a few inches, and the cool air moved through the car with the smell of cut grass and something blooming he couldn't identify, and he drove without the radio on because the quiet felt right. He thought about the past 6 months, about a Tuesday in October and a marble hallway and 2 words, about a veterinary clinic on Millbrook Road and a waiting room chair, and the specific weight of realizing you had almost missed something irreplaceable, about Duke returning to duty, whole and capable, those amber eyes as clear and steady as they had ever been, about a backyard full of paper lanterns and azalea blooms and a dog lying in the grass with his chin on a child's shoes. He thought about what Lily had done and what it had required of her, not skill, not training, not any of the things that adults spent years accumulating in the belief that expertise was the primary tool of genuine understanding. What it had required was simpler and harder than any of that. It had required her to look at something without deciding in advance what she would see, to be present without a filter, to take seriously what she observed rather than reassigning it to the category of nothing significant, because nothing significant was the more comfortable interpretation. He thought about all the things in the world that were quietly asking to be seen, all the small signals and subtle tilts and almost imperceptible asymmetries that existed in the spaces between people and animals, and the ordinary circumstances of daily life, waiting with the patient dignity of things that cannot ask directly to be noticed. All the Dukes, not just the 4-legged kind, who showed up every day and did their work, and trusted that the people closest to them were paying the kind of attention that closeness was supposed to enable. He thought about how easy it was to stop paying that kind of attention, how familiarity built its comfortable architecture around perception, and slowly, without announcement, began to substitute expectation for observation. How expertise, which was supposed to sharpen your ability to see, could sometimes sand the edges off your willingness to be surprised by what was actually there. How the people who had known someone longest were sometimes the last to notice when something had changed, precisely because they were so accustomed to the version they already knew. And he thought about a child who had walked into a building she had never entered before and met an animal she had never seen and brought to that meeting nothing but open eyes and a heart that had been taught by loss to look carefully at the living things it loved. 2 words, he said. Not a diagnosis, not a clinical assessment, not the product of training or certification or years of professional experience. Just the honest, undefended report of someone who had looked at another creature and received what that creature was communicating and taken it seriously enough to say it out loud in a marble hallway full of adults who had forgotten, or never learned, or slowly unlearned, how to do exactly that. Duke would serve 3 more decorated years with the Hargrove County Sheriff's Department. He would assist in 14 additional narcotics cases. He would help locate 2 more missing persons. He would receive a departmental commendation that Webb would frame and hang in the hallway of his house, next to a photograph of the 2 of them, taken at a training exercise in the summer. Duke mid-leap over a low obstacle, Webb watching from the side with an expression that anyone who knew him would recognize immediately as pride. He would retire on a warm day in September 3 years later, walking away from his last official shift with the same composed, unhurried dignity he had brought to the first one. And he would go home with Webb to the 5-acre property outside of town and spend his retirement in the uncomplicated happiness of a dog who has done good work and knows it, and is now entirely content to let the tennis balls and the afternoon sun be enough. Lily would turn 5, and then 6, and then 7. She would acquire, at the age of 5.5, a rescue beagle named Clover who would sleep at the foot of her bed every night and tolerate being dressed in doll hats with the patient dignity of an animal that understood its role perfectly. She would continue to be the child who noticed things in animals, in people, in the quiet spaces between what was said and what was meant. Her teachers would note it. Her friends would rely on it. Sandra would watch it grow and deepen, and become more articulate over the years without ever losing the essential quality that had been there from the beginning, the willingness to look without deciding first what she would see. She would not remember the courthouse with any real clarity. She was 3. The marble floors and the heavy doors and the fluorescent lights had not lodged themselves in the part of her memory where durable images are stored. What she would remember, in the vague, impressionistic way that early childhood experiences persist, more feeling than picture, more sense than narrative, was a dog. A large, warm, serious dog with amber eyes that had looked at her like she had said something true. The weight of a chin on her shoes, the slow certain movement of a tail against grass. She would not know, for many years, the full shape of what those 2 words had done. She would not know about Dr. Ose, and the ear canal and the word retirement, and the narrow margin between cotton time and too late. She would not know about Webb in the waiting room chair, or the index card in her mother's kitchen drawer, or the newspaper piece that had traveled across 3 states on the quiet current of people sharing things that reminded them that the world contained more goodness than the headlines suggested. She would simply know what she had always known, in the wordless, foundational way that the most important knowledge lives, that living things deserve to be looked at carefully, that paying attention was something you did for others, not just for yourself, that 2 words said honestly from a place of genuine seeing could land in the world and do something real, could change what happened next, could save something worth saving. The spring evening deepened around Webb's truck as it moved through the Tennessee countryside. The last light was going out of the western sky in layers, rose and amber, and the particular deep blue that comes just before dark, when the day has fully released itself, and the night is not yet complete. Fireflies were beginning in the fields on either side of the road, small intermittent lights appearing and disappearing in the tall grass like punctuation in a language that didn't require translation. Duke shifted in the back, resettled, and was quiet. Webb drove on through the soft Tennessee dark, and the road ahead was long and clear, and somewhere in a white apartment with a juice-stained dress hanging over the back of a chair, and a beagle not yet acquired, and a whole life not yet fully lived, a 4-year-old girl with dark eyes and pink sneakers was being tucked into bed by her mother, who smoothed her hair back from her forehead and kissed her once and said, "Good night, baby. You did something wonderful today." And Lily, already half asleep, already traveling toward whatever vivid and uncomplicated world children travel toward when they close their eyes, smiled without opening them. She already knew. She had always known.